Good afternoon. Let's get started. Next week, we don't have a speaker, but we have a very special event that happens once every semester at this series. It's the Student Research Showcase, where we'll have two of our advanced PhD students talk about their research. And the idea here is to catalyze more research interest among the students in the audience. Our first speaker next week will be Sean Wood. He'll talk to us about lithium-ion batteries and his research there. And then our second speaker will be Sebastian Suris. He'll talk to us about adoption of residential solar and some of the modeling that he has been doing. It's a great pleasure to introduce our speaker to you today, Kate Larsen. Kate is the director at Rhodium Group, where she manages the firm's work on US and global climate change policy. It's a really great opportunity to actually have Kate amongst us. As I'll describe to you just in a second, she has been really at the center in very important aspects of global and US climate change policy, as well as all sorts of very important issues around measurement, verification, and reporting around this. Before joining Rhodium Group, Kate worked at the White House Council on Environmental Quality, where she was the Deputy Director on Energy and Climate Change. And before that, for 6 years, Kate worked at the Office of Climate Change at the US Department of State, where she served as the Chief US Negotiator on mitigation commitments and compliance in the UN climate negotiations. She was a primary architect of the first universal system for measurement, reporting, and verification for involving both developed and developing countries and for their emissions commitments at the UN. Prior to the State Department, she has worked at many important agencies, including the International Energy Agency in Paris, the World Resources Institute in Washington, and the Environmental Defense Fund. She received her bachelor's degree from an institution to which I have connections to, Stanford University, and has a master's of public affairs from a great university, the University of Texas. Welcome, Kate. Please join me in welcoming Kate.
Thanks, it's great to be here. I left the LBJ school in 2007 to move to Washington, and I think my greatest disappointment was to learn that wearing flip-flops was not the acceptable footwear for Washington, and so I always enjoy having a chance to come back to Austin, where things are a little bit more casual. I'm pretty excited not to be in Paris right now, or preparing to go to Paris right now, because I think these negotiations and the issue of climate change is one of the most complex that the world has to solve. It involves every aspect of the economy, equity, rights, development, and it involves every industry. So it's not just a government issue. So it's pretty complicated, and I will start off by making a lot of comparisons to what happened in Copenhagen in 2009. A lot of people have different opinions about Copenhagen. I'll start off with my personal opinion about it, so you know how that colors the rest of what I'm going to say. I believe Copenhagen was a wild success because it launched countries into a process of developing their own national programs to reduce emissions for the very first time, regardless of whether there was a treaty binding all countries to implement them. It really launched us on a path for countries to take action and responsibility at home when they realized that also backed up a lot of the other priorities that they had for development, clean energy, health, other aspects of development that were also prioritized when they started to tackle climate change. So what I'm going to talk about today is just what's happening in the lead up to the Paris negotiations. How are things looking for an agreement there? What does it all mean? One of the biggest aspects of the potential agreement is what are countries going to do to reduce emissions? What are they committing to do? And what are now called nationally determined contributions. This is what countries are submitting to the UN as their proposed contributions to the international agreement. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about what the US has said it would do and what that means here in the US, how hard it will be to meet our own commitments. And then a little bit more about some of the major economies that are, of course, of most interest to US and domestic audiences here. What are China and India doing, along with some of the other major economies, and what does that mean for our prospects for actually achieving some of our emission reduction goals, limiting climate change to under 2 degrees Celsius by the end of this century. So just a quick overview of where things stand. Paris is sort of a milestone along a very long chain of activity on international climate change. In 1992, nations adopted for the first time the Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was very vague. It said we should all do something on climate change. It's important. It laid out a bunch of general principles that countries should follow. But it didn't require any specific commitments from countries. That came next in 1997 with the Kyoto Protocol, which many of you have heard of, had legally binding targets for only developed countries. The U.S. at the time agreed under the Clinton administration, but it was not ratified by the U.S. Senate, and later the Bush administration rejected the agreement. It went on to be implemented, but it launched a process for a more inclusive type of agreement that ended in Copenhagen with the agreement there, which expanded a lot of that work to include countries beyond just the developed countries. And then with that, launched a new process looking forward for 2020 and beyond. What are we going to do after the Copenhagen commitments have been fulfilled? What do we do about long-term reductions in the post-2020 timeframe? And that's what is being discussed right now in Copenhagen. The process has been going on for years now. It's been intensive negotiations. They just had a bunch of ministers meeting in Paris for the last time they sit down together before the Paris negotiations. There will be a G20 Leaders Summit next week where heads of state will sit down together, and there are plans for closed-door meetings where they will hammer out some of those details among themselves. Of course, the negotiations that will take place the first couple of weeks in Paris. But that's just the beginning. This is a process, a continuous process where countries submit commitments for a short time period. But as we know, this is a long-term problem. So what does that mean for how it's ratified, if it's a legal agreement going forward, but also how is it implemented over time? That will take years. And then we have round two after those commitments are put forward. What do we do for the next round? So that's all part of the discussion. And there the same major issues that are under discussion that have been under discussion since the beginning of the negotiations. The first is, what are we trying to do? What is our long-term goal? And that was established in Copenhagen under very vague language as the priority of keeping climate change to below 2 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels, which scientists broadly thought would give us a good chance of maintaining at least non-catastrophic outcomes on climate change. What does that mean in terms of what countries do? Very hard to say, because it's very difficult to translate those types of temperature goals down to what countries need to do on the operational level. So one of those issues that they're talking about for Paris is, how do we make that long-term goal more specific? How do we send a signal to the world, to industry and others, that we're serious about reducing emissions? How do we operationalize that in a way that's easy to understand? Mitigation is the term for reducing emissions. That's one of the biggest, of course, components of the discussions. Adaptation, for the first time, adaptation itself. How do countries prepare for the impacts of climate change and build resilience to those impacts? That's going to be a major part of the negotiations in a way that it hasn't before, because until now, many countries said, if we start talking about adaptation, we are admitting defeat, that we are not going to be able to reduce emissions in time. And now it is very clear that climate change is already happening. Countries are needing to take action. How do we support them in building, as they are developing, a system not only for reducing emissions, but doing so in a way that makes them less vulnerable to the climate change that we've already, that's already baked into the system. Finance, of course, is one of the biggest sticking points. In Copenhagen, one of the things that got the deal over the edge was a commitment by developed countries to mobilize $100 billion a year in climate finance for developing countries by 2020. That was the deal sweetener that allowed a lot of countries to come on board for that agreement. As we've seen, it's really hard now for countries to get Congress and their parliaments to fund money to send overseas, especially when some of that money is going to countries that are their primary competitors. So there's been a lot of discussion now about how do we go further, the recognition that it's the private sector that's going to need to pony up a lot of this money. Most of the investment in the clean energy technologies and system is going to have to come from the private sector. How do governments send the signal to get them to leverage that kind of the scale of finance that's necessary to transition every economy? And transparency is about how do we know countries are going to do what they said they would do? This measurement, reporting, and verification system, that's very important. And there are two sort of cross-cutting issues that are probably the thorniest when you're thinking about what countries are really arguing about. The first is what will the agreement look like? Is it going to be a legally binding treaty? who will it bind, and in what form? A lot of different views about what is the most effective way to control emissions and whether or not a legally binding treaty is the most effective way to do that. And the second issue is what people refer to as differentiation. How do we refer to different groups of countries that have very different responsibilities and different capabilities? Is Chad equally responsible as China or as the US? Do we treat them the same? Obviously not, but defining categories of countries that are have to do the same thing gets very complicated, as you can imagine. So that's been one of the main sticking points in the negotiations since they began. But in general, there's been a lot of progress in finding common ground of where the agreement might land and what people are calling landing zones for the agreement. And this is how many countries have come together, have sort of scoped out this potential landing zone that if all the pieces come together, I would predict that it would look something like this. So long-term goal, looking at collective action to decarbonize our economy probably by mid-century. And calling on countries to do the analysis and looking at what their contribution to that would be. How do you even start to know what it's like to decarbonize your economy until you start looking at what that would mean for your country? A lot of countries haven't been able to do this type of analysis, but this is something that could really be a game changer, even though it's not a very specific binding kind of commitment. It's a process that gets governments thinking about the long term in a way that most countries don't ever have to do. We think about 5-year cycles, we think about 10-year cycles, but how do you think about a problem that's 100 years in span that we need to start solving now, and it's going to cost money now, but help future generations? On differentiation, people are lining up around basically a de facto differentiation where countries are allowed to self-select what categories they fit in. That is reflected in the general principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. Countries are all responsible at varying degrees, and they're allowed to determine how much they want to contribute to the solution. That's been really difficult because for a long time now we've separated countries into two categories, developed and developing. Countries with very low GDP, Ukraine, others are listed as developed countries, where a lot of developing countries include Singapore, some of the most wealthy countries from the Middle East. Those are all classified as developing countries and have been treated the same as some of the least developed countries. That's not a workable system anymore when we're talking about getting countries to contribute. So what experts are saying is most likely to happen is that they'll just paper over the issue by not talking about it. They'll just say that countries are encouraged to do what they can. That's something that often conflicts with the need to have very strict legally binding commitments. And I think there's this theme of compromising on real direct legally binding attributes versus allowing a more bottom-up structure where countries are allowed to develop their own commitments within their own context with their own stakeholders so that it's nationally appropriate to them without putting categories or needing to recategorize countries as those conditions change. Again, that's reflected in how countries' mitigation targets are going to look. It's inherently flexible. They get to develop them themselves, which means they're much more likely to actually implement them than if the UN came down and said, here's your target, go now and do that. That's sort of the theme across the board. One of the major issues is, what do we do? We know that the commitments that countries are putting forward now aren't going to be enough. So how do we take stock of where we are over time and then ratchet up those efforts? That's one of the major sticking points, and I think a lot of countries are pushing for a regular assessment of our progress, and it's looking likely that that might be part of the agreement. Same adaptation and finance. These are all pushing countries to put forward a plan for how they will develop strategies for adapting, for encouraging private sector finance for clean energies and technologies in their country. Finally, on legal form, this is one that will probably be held until the very last minute. You've heard a lot of discussion these days about who wants a legally binding treaty versus EU is pushing the US is saying we can't do it. I think this has been a proxy for some for whether or not countries are ambitious about climate change, and I would argue that it has very little to do with that. It's more an issue of domestic constraints, the US having a very difficult time getting anything ratified by the Senate, in particular something that has the word climate change on it, or the UN. But that, what's more important is that countries are committed to do what they said they would do. So despite all of this bickering about what the ultimate form will be, is the legal advisors to most countries have worked out a deal. I think that will likely include a mix of legal and political outcomes. So there are all these different types of documents that the UN can issue. It's likely that there will be a legally binding requirement for countries to develop and put forward their commitments and for them to report on the progress towards meeting them. But those commitments themselves, as in the case for the United States of reducing their emissions 26 to 28% by 2025, meeting that target won't itself be legally binding. And that is threading the needle of getting Congress, getting the Senate not to need to ratify an outcome. And that's a very interesting needle to thread, because for a lot of countries, legally binding really is the barometer of seriousness, because a lot of countries are concerned about what happens when this president is gone. Everyone's hearing the current GOP candidates about wanting to abolish the EPA, get rid of the Clean Power Plan. What happens if we have a President Trump? Those countries are concerned that the President Obama's promises to reduce emissions will go up in smoke the second we have a new president. So for them, a legally binding treaty seems like it could be something more permanent. I'm not sure that is actually the case, as we saw with Japan and Canada, who ratified the Kyoto Protocol. If they weren't meeting, they had new government, they weren't going to meet their targets, they dropped out of the protocol. They didn't, actually, that wasn't a binding commitment on them, even with a government change. So I think that's probably one of the less important substantively, but probably most important in terms of the optics of whether the agreement is actually significant or not. This is, the lead up into Paris right now, everyone is looking at the text and freaking out because it looks totally unwieldy, and it's very similar, almost the exact situation that we had in the lead up to Copenhagen. This was something that I did with a bunch of my New Zealand negotiating colleagues at like 3 in the morning in the lead up to Copenhagen. This is a map of all of the proposals and issues contained in the Copenhagen text that we hadn't decided on yet, that we had like 2 days to finalize, and there was still no agreement on any of these things. This is more or less what the text looks like now. It's really hard to imagine a process in Copenhagen now where 190 countries are going to iron out all the details of all of these issues. So what's likely to shape up again, just like in Copenhagen, a 2-page text with very big, broad, directional agreements that countries will then have to operationalize later in implementing decisions. But what happens in these negotiations is nothing is agreed until everything agreed, and everyone takes hostages, so they all throw all the things that they want in there, and it really can't be boiled down until the last minute, which is why there's such chaos usually in these negotiations. There's another issue that's slightly different from what we were facing in Copenhagen, and that's a real, much more diverse arrangement and alignment of negotiating groups. So before, there traditionally was the G77 in China, which was all of the developing countries aligned together in one big group. And then you had the EU, and then you had the umbrella group, which was the US, New Zealand, Japan, Russia, Norway, Canada, Australia, and Kazakhstan. And then a couple of other countries that were sort of in the middle, Switzerland, Mexico, South Korea, that formed a group. In general, it was the developed countries and often the AOSIS group, the Alliance of Small Island States, who were really pushing for ambitious outcomes, while the G77 was pushing for the developed countries only to take commitments and for finance for the developing countries. That was sort of the stereotypical debate that we had. In Copenhagen, we had a new group, the basic group, which is Brazil, China, India, South Africa, that formed. That group is splintering a little bit now with different alliances forming. There is what is now called the like-minded developing countries, which is a really interesting mix of countries. It's Algeria, Argentina, Bangladesh, Bolivia, China, Cuba, Ecuador, Egypt, El Salvador, India, Jordan, Iraq, Kuwait, Indonesia, Iran, Malaysia, Mali, Nicaragua, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Sri Lanka, Sudan, Venezuela, Vietnam. If you think about what aligns those countries together, it's a really interesting mix, and it basically formed as a group that wanted to demand that really just developed countries should be responsible for taking action and for paying for it. And I think it's been an interesting group because it has now been counterbalanced by other developing countries like the Latin American coalition of Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, and a bunch of others that are taking action who have said, we're also small developing countries, but we want to also be bound to take responsibility and take action, and we believe that all countries should take action according to their responsibility, not just developed countries, because we know we can't solve this problem with just developed countries anymore. That's been an interesting mix of realigning views, and this is just a map here. This is one example of groups' positions on whether the treaty should be legally binding or not. The red is countries who don't believe it should be legally binding. The blue are those that want it to be legally binding. And the light blue are those that want it to be legally binding, but just for developed countries. And the white sort of in between, I would argue that most of the whites are arguing for it just to be bound on developed countries. But it's a really interesting mix now because it really throws a lot of uncertainty onto the process. In Copenhagen, what usually happens when you have disagreement among 190 countries is they send their group's representatives to a smaller room where you have 20 to 30 countries around a table, and they hammer it out because that's the only way to get through all those details. And then they bring it back to everyone and it's adopted. And in Copenhagen, we had about 5 countries that opposed the adoption of the text. It was Bolivia, Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Sudan. And primarily, there were many reasons, but their primary concern was that it talked about markets, and they didn't want anything reflecting capitalism in the agreement. It sounds kind of kooky, but these are the things that happen sometimes, and they were emboldened to oppose the deal. And what allowed them to do that was there was this lingering doubt among a lot of the other countries who didn't feel like their views were adequately addressed. And so that was what took down Copenhagen. In the end, countries then worked on formalizing the deal again. But that was a very small coalition of countries that was very outspoken. I would argue that that group has grown. This group of like-minded developing countries has been emboldened to make a lot more demands, and I think that for many of them there isn't that much in a deal for them. There's not going to be as much finance on the table this time, which was what brought a lot of those countries along. And so this is, I think, a very interesting thing to watch in the negotiations to see, are these countries going to be spoilers or not? There's a lot of other issues going on, but that's one I think would be interesting to keep an eye on. So now transitioning a little bit into looking at what countries have committed to do, we're in a really different world again than we were in Copenhagen. Starting in Kyoto, the commitments that were put forward for emission reductions really only applied to a small sliver of countries, representing a very small share of global emissions, about 13%, and an even smaller share of global emissions in 2020. With Copenhagen, that expanded. The blue is countries that have taken on mitigation targets under Kyoto, representing about 36% of global emissions. Now we're looking at Paris, and I think this was updated recently. Over almost 3/4 of countries have taken on mitigation targets. The green is mitigation actions. Those are things like solar goals or forest goals. But it's a large majority of countries representing now about 90% of emissions. So things have changed substantially since Copenhagen, and that's a real positive trend. Here's just an overview of all the countries that have submitted what are called nationally determined contributions. It's their mitigation commitment, what they plan to do. They take a huge range of different types of commitments. And again, this was another way that the flexibility in the system really enabled a lot of countries to participate. If everyone had to put forward a economy-wide emission reduction target like the US has done, many countries would not have done it because it doesn't fit with their national context. There's a whole range of things. A lot of countries are developed, almost entirely all developed countries put forward an economy-wide emission reduction target from a base year. So Canada, US, others. Many of the developing countries, because they are uncertain about their development path, put forward a commitment that is a reduction from emissions from business as usual, but doesn't commit them to to reduce emissions from a current level. Many of those like Korea, Singapore, and others. And then there are a lot of others that are goals that look at reducing or increasing, yes?
Are there different base years?
Again, that's a reflection of just flexibility in different systems. So because countries have already been putting in place policies, those have already been benchmarked to a certain year. Europe picked 1990. That was the year that Kyoto used for the base year, and that was pretty good for them because that was around when they were peaking anyway. The US uses 2005 because that was when we peaked, so it was a better number, and because Waxman-Markey legislation, which was what we keyed our 2020 target to, used that year. So it's just a reflection of whatever a country is able to pass through their Congress or their Parliament, it reflects whatever numbers work best for them. So then there are a bunch of others now that are looking at, like India's target recently, 40% non-fossil electricity. A lot of countries are able to put forward something that helps them get domestic support. India would never be able to get public support for a commitment to stop their economic growth, to reduce their emissions, but this is something that can gain public support. But of course, we know that it's not going to get us all the way we need to be in terms of reaching all of our long-term climate goals. Here in the blue shows where the commitments put forward so far will get us unconditionally, so without any support, any money going towards countries. That will get us to about 2.7 degrees Celsius, about. The dark orange is conditional pledges, so I will only do this if other countries pay me to do it. That gets you a little bit more, but we're only about half of the way we need to be in 2030 to set us on a path to reach our goals in 2100. Oops. So just looking a little bit now at what the U.S. is doing, this is, it's been a really interesting time because the U.S. has really shifted its perspective on climate change since 2009, has gained a lot of leverage in the international community because of the commitment to 20% or 17% reductions by 2020, the President's Climate Action Plan that has been put in place, consistently reducing emissions in most sectors of the economy. Late last year, the President announced a commitment for 2025 that would go forward to Paris, reducing U.S. emissions 26 to 28% by 2025. That's going to be pretty difficult for us to do right now with policy in place by the end of 2012, so not counting all the new announcements about the Clean Power Plan and others. The U.S. is pretty much on a trajectory to get about 5% emission reductions in 2025. That's the business as usual, this blue dotted line. With the policies in place, we're getting closer to meeting the 2020 target. That's that green line. If we're able to reach that commitment, it's going to be even steeper for us to make reductions between 2020 and 2025. It's about double the rate of emission reductions. I think between 2005 and 2020, the average annual emission reductions were about 1.2% for the U.S. over that period. We'll have to double that rate of reductions between 2020 and 2025. So it's a pretty steep shift after 2020. We did some very preliminary estimates. There's still new work being done on our baseline, but this looks at the projections for U.S. emissions in 2025, absent any policy. And then we've done some just preliminary work looking at where those emission reductions might come from, given the types of policy that have been announced so far to date. So we modeled the Clean Power Plan, the announcement to regulate greenhouse or carbon dioxide emissions from new and existing power plants across the U.S. We modeled a scenario, because it will highly depend on what states implement, when they implement, and how they implement those requirements. That's all very much to be determined over the course of the next few years, and some approaches are much more ambitious than others. We just modeled if every state met its rate-based requirement that EPA assigned it for 2025 without any emissions trading. Looks like the Clean Power Plan would get about 450 million metric tons of CO2 by 2025. You look at other energy CO2 actions. The administration has announced fuel economy, ratcheting up fuel economy standards for heavy-duty vehicles. There's a lot of efficiency standards, appliance efficiency standards, other VMT reduction transport initiatives. We modeled that. It gets you about another 160. On methane, the President announced a goal to reduce methane emissions from the oil and gas sector by 40 to 45% by 2025. That gets you another 115. And then HFCs, which are the fluids that are used in air conditioning, refrigeration, making progress there, hopefully even more next year under the Montreal Protocol, where countries are committing to phase down those emissions, which are really strong greenhouse gas contributors. That's another big chunk that if we were able to get a Montreal Protocol amendment, the U.S. could significantly reduce HFC emissions even more. All that said, we're still at 18.5% in 2025. So what does that mean? How do we get there? There's still a lot more that needs to be done. The final year of the Obama administration will set all of that in motion, but it will really depend on the next administration to find ways to get us there. So just now to wrap up, I want to talk a little bit about India and China because, as most people have heard, when you try to make the case in the U.S. To push forward clean energy and climate change policies, the first thing you hear is, well, China's not doing anything, why should we? We've heard that a long time, and you can say what you will about whether they're doing it fast enough, but China's certainly doing much more than they had in the past, and it will be a really important breakthrough, at least for the climate negotiations, to have China taking domestic action. So last November, the two heads of state made a joint announcement of their commitments for Paris, but also a commitment to work together. This was a big signal being sent by the two largest emitters that they were serious about climate change, that they were going to take action domestically, and that they were going to work together in Paris, which was a very important signal to send because in a lot of the narrative in Copenhagen was the U.S. and China butting heads. And I think there are a lot of reasons for that. They will continue to do so in Paris, but I think sending the signal to the rest of the world is very important. There are a lot of countries that were hiding behind the U.S.-China debate to not take action themselves, and I think this was a really important signal. So China's commitment is reflected a lot in their own domestic policy. So peaking emissions, stopping to increase emissions, and then declining emissions after 2030 with their best effort to do so earlier. 20% of all energy consumption would be from non-fossil sources, renewables, hydro, nuclear, and an increase in the forest stock significantly. So this whole process of countries putting forward their own commitments and being responsible for determining what kind of responsibility they have really requires a lot more in terms of peer review. There's not going to be a detailed compliance process. It's really, do we feel, after looking at what countries have put forward, that they're doing enough, that it's enough for us to continue working together? This was part of the process that the U.S. and China went through when they were analyzing whether or not they would stand up together to make that announcement. It wasn't always a given. It was only until both parties were confident that the other country was going to be doing enough that they felt like it was reasonable to stand up and support each other in making those statements. So these are the kinds of questions that they're asking each other. Does this go beyond what we've already said we would do? How much is it different from the path we're already on? Does it try to bend the path from business as usual? How does it stack up against what we're doing? Can we sell this at home and say that they're taking equal effort and responsibility? And is it consistent with our global climate objectives? Because if we, U.S. and China, as the two major emitters, aren't able to be even anywhere close to where the world needs to be in this time frame, how can we say that we're asking others to do the same? So we did some of this work when they were discussing whether or not they would announce the commitments, looking at whether or not this is going beyond China's BAU. And this is some of the stuff that countries will be looking at as we evaluate what others are doing. These are projections from the EIA, IEA, and some of the labs and a Chinese group of the business as usual Chinese emissions out to 2030. All of them going up, continuing to go up. This is the BAU, no peaking or reductions in sight. So then when you start looking at what would China do if they implemented new policies, as we have seen on the horizon because of their other priorities for air pollution and health, what are the sort of best case scenario for what China could be doing given the other priorities? And these are a few scenarios. The red and the purple and the yellow are accelerating the trend of moving towards clean energy in China. You can see that they all sort of peak out around 2030. The IEA ran a scenario where would China need to be with their energy CO2 emissions to be consistent with the 2-degree goal. That has them peaking in 2020. That's not going to happen. So this is about the range of where China could be, where they need to be. This is the context that the U.S. looked at when considering, and now other countries are looking at when they're looking at the Chinese commitment to say, is this better than they were going to do anyway? And in general, yes, it's better than they would do anyway. Where they fit in this range is important. the caveat that they will try to peak earlier than 2030 is very important. They can't commit that they'll get there, but the push will be there. I think that's important, an important caveat. Another is the non-fossil goal for China. That's a really big deal. It would imply installation of about 800 to 1,000 gigawatts of power, of clean power in China, which is basically like more than all the coal power they have, more than all power capacity in the US. It's huge. So it's a ton of clean power. It will bring prices down across the world. It's a big deal. So that in itself is important, and I think made the U.S. and others now comfortable that China is taking action consistent with their responsibility. Is it enough? No, but no one knows yet how to do it so that it's consistent with the long-term goal. India, another big country that is of interest, their announcement was pretty similar to what China did, carbon intensity target, a non-fossil energy goal, and then an additional forest commitment. And one of the things, India is very different from China. They often get lumped together, and I think in general there's an understanding within the international community, and India's been very good at making this clear. They do not feel like their per capita emissions are much lower, their level of development is much lower. Part of their submission of their commitment included a ton of caveats that we will need to have support, technology capacity building support. And they were very upfront in the beginning and said coal will continue to dominate power generation in the future. And of course, this is the source of a lot of concern, but India has much different needs than a lot of other countries in terms of providing power. And the question is there a way to direct that clean energy focus in a way that also limits coal, or does it in a more clean way? And that's, I think, where most of the community is focused. We did a little bit of a digging in onto India and China, the specific commitments, just to look at what does this mean in terms of what they were going to do anyway under current policy. If you look at the carbon intensity targets, China basically has committed to 60 to 65% reduction in carbon intensity from 2005 levels. That's pretty much consistent with their reduction in carbon intensity from the past 25 years. Where that's the same rate of reduction that they have achieved over the past 25 years. Their goal is pretty much bookending their commitment. So it's hard to say, but it's more or less in the range of their business as usual. So this wasn't the most ambitious piece of China's commitment. India is very different. It's a little bit more ambitious because over the last 25 years, India's energy intensity has only declined by 26%, so this is taking them further than they've been able to do in the past, even though the 33 to 35% emission reduction in carbon intensity is not quite as high as what IEA projects would be their business as usual pathway. But of course, India is very different in that they will also be building a lot of new power infrastructure, and if that's done as it needs to be done, but if it's done in a very carbon-intensive way with a lot of coal, that will make achieving this goal even more difficult. Then when you look at the non-fossil commitments, India and China's commitments were very different. India's was about the electric generating capacity, so not the actual electricity produced, but the capacity of generation. And China's was focused on the energy consumption, the actual energy consumption across the economy, not just electricity, but also from transport and all other sectors. So if you look at current day 2012 non-fossil share, India's pretty high at 30%. The policies, though, in place now mean that gets eaten away a little bit by additional coal power. But their INDC target is for 40%. So that's going a lot farther, and that's a pretty big deal. China also is pretty goes pretty well beyond what business as usual would be in terms of power capacity. But as we know, the capacity matters a lot less to the environment, to the atmosphere, than actual power generation. So we converted those commitments into total power generation. And as you see for both India and China, it's a significant increase from business as usual levels across the board. So I just want to wrap up by saying there's a lot of speculation about what's going to happen in Paris. There are a lot of different potential outcomes. It's really all up in the air. But I would argue that again, like in Copenhagen, we've set ourselves on this new path where countries are developing and submitting national plans to reduce emissions and to adapt to those impacts from climate change in a way that has never happened before. That's really important because some of these countries didn't even have offices that had climate change as their stated mission. They didn't have staff who was charged with developing a greenhouse gas emissions inventory. Now they have someone sitting often in the Prime Minister's office or the President's office whose job is to focus on this because their leader has to go to Paris now to talk about this and to defend what they've put forward. But as they develop these plans, countries are also seeing that it's helping to achieve a lot of the other goals that they have: clean energy, health because of air pollution from vehicles and from power plants. So it's really created a revolution in how countries are thinking and acting on climate change. Would it help if there was a wildly successful, everyone agreed outcome in Paris? Yes, it would be very helpful. It would set us back a little bit if it was seen as a huge disaster. But in general, just like with Copenhagen, countries are implementing what they said they would do, and they're being held to that, even if it's not a legally binding commitment. Most countries are implementing or on track with their 2020 targets. And regardless of what happens just in Paris, over the course of the next few years, countries will be working together to mobilize the type of finance and other capacity support to implement these policies. And they've told their publics that they're going to do this. Their head of state has their face and name on this commitment, and it's much more likely that they'll implement them because they were developed domestically through a domestic process. So I'm feeling very optimistic and hopeful about what will come out of Paris, not just the agreement itself, but what it means for our ability to transition away from a carbonized society. With that, I will open it up to questions. Yeah. Hi.
As you know, all of our environmental pollution efforts have taken decades, if not close to centuries. You know, you look at water, air pollution, et cetera, and climate's following the same thing. And it is interesting that when you look at how other international agreements have been implemented, when countries make commitments, they're generally stuck a little bit. They may not eventually implement them fully, but they're stuck in a net of their own devise. So I guess the bottom line is you are relatively optimistic that this process of countries identifying what they're able to do and willing to do, that we can eventually ratchet things down and at least make some progress towards reducing emissions.
I am. I'm concerned that it's not fast enough. And just in going through the process and working in the White House trying to figure out how we get to our goals, it's really hard. It's hard for a rich country like the U.S. It's going to be even harder for countries that are trying to figure out how to bring power to millions of people that don't have it. And so I think what's important is that this gets countries thinking about it down the track towards doing it. And I think that the question of how we go further, how we leverage that, will come with time. We need to keep pushing on it. But just as with other environmental agreements, regulations for air pollution and others, once we start, innovation helps us get there much more cheaply and quicker than we imagined it was possible. And now that I live in the Silicon Valley, am more wildly optimistic about our ability to do that. But again, I think it will take real concerted action and continued focus.
Thank you. Hey, how are you?
Great.
My question is, you mentioned a couple, if you wouldn't mind expanding a little bit on when you mentioned the Kyoto Protocol, how some countries had a legally binding agreement. What does that mean, like legally binding? Like, okay, I promise we're going to meet this target. What happens if you don't? Like, do you just pay a fine? Or is it like just like you talked about the United States, like, well, a new administration is, and we know the other administration said that they're going to meet that, but we don't care. It's a new administration now, and we're moving forward with this new narrative. Like, it's tough because climate change and even this whole movement toward renewable energy is a long-term process. And when you have short-term, administrations, 4 years, 8 years, it's tough to continue with that movement. So
That's right. The Kyoto Protocol was a really interesting case study, very different from what we're dealing with now because it was a treaty that all countries negotiated and ratified. So in essence, they were a party to a legally binding treaty. But the treaty only required a handful of developed countries to actually meet reduction commitments. So while all participated in and contributed to that agreement, only a small number were required to meet those targets. And a lot of them did, but the ones that were not on track as time went on dropped out. They removed themselves from the protocol. So Japan, Australia, because of changing government, Japan had the Fukushima disaster, and for them, it didn't make sense. And so I think there's this tension between wanting a lasting long-term agreement that is held in place regardless of the changing political winds in other countries. But as we've seen, international law has very little teeth when countries are determined to get out of it. And so the idea is that by making it more flexible, more facilitative, so if a country is not on track to meet its goal or to do what it said it would do, there's a process to help them get there without penalizing them. So imposing large fines on Bangladesh because it didn't meet its goal isn't going to do anyone any good. How do we help, bring in UN experts to help them think through what they're going to do next? That kind of a process. And there's a lot of different views about whether or not legally binding means you're more serious or not. I think a lot of people from the climate world are trying to be more pragmatic this time around, to have it be more inclusive, more flexible, so that more countries join and feel welcome as part of the process. And that's the idea with this time around as well.
So you mentioned that for a lot of these countries, it's going to be really hard for them to reach the goals that they've set forth. Have there been any really innovative policies that have been coming out that maybe sounds kind of crazy right now, but just might work?
This is one of those issues where we all know what we need to do. They're the types of efforts that you need to take to reduce emissions. It's very clear where it's coming from. It's the tools and the innovation is in trying to get the right stakeholders and constituencies on board with those strategies or those tools that we know will work. A lot of countries are doing really different things. Costa Rica wants to be carbon neutral, zero emissions by 2030 or 2040, something really insane. Norway also is looking at that. Those are the countries that have decided they want to be pioneers. It will be easier for them to do it because they're already very low emitting. But I think there's a lot of the reason, one of the rationales behind letting countries devise their own way is that everyone's going to do it differently. Some are going to do it really well and have lessons that other countries can learn by watching them. Countries are at different stages of their development process. Some countries can leapfrog the developed countries because they don't have to do all of that locked-in infrastructure development that we have that now, we have all these roads. We have to keep repairing them. People aren't going to get out of their cars. How do you avoid that kind of a model in another country? There's a lot of great creative thinking that's going on here, and a lot of that's happening in the private sector. And the question is, how do governments respond to and create the right incentives for companies like Lyft to partner with transit so that you get people out of car ownership? It opens up a whole new potential for decarbonizing the transport sector, autonomous vehicles connected with transit, all of those things that have a real potential, but they could also go in a totally different direction. If there's not an overlying climate goal in that state or in that country, you could see development of autonomous vehicles where they get bigger, they're fueled by fossil fuels, and everyone has their own, and they drive all around without us in them, and you increase your emissions by 100%. So having sort of the overarching goals helps move innovation and technology and finance and all those other areas in the right direction. So there's I think that's the space that's most interesting, and of course the overarching, when the economists get asked about it, they're like, carbon price, greenhouse gas emission price, like just put a price on it. That's happening in some places, but so far it really hasn't gotten its way into the ecosystem in a significant way. And from the modeling we've done, it's going to be, the kind of carbon price you would need to put on in the U.S. to get decarbonization of the transportation sector at the pace we need to get like 80% reductions in emissions by 2050, you need like a $400 a ton tax on carbon. That, like we couldn't even get a $20 carbon fee right now. So, that's, the tools that make the most theoretical sense are not the ones that are going to be politically feasible. How do you navigate that difference in the meantime is the main question right now.
So I read recently that the Keystone XL ruling should give the U.S. a lot of leverage at the negotiating table in Paris. What's your take on that?
I think the U.S., the principal leverage that the U.S. had, they got from walking the talk on climate change, on implementing the standards and policies that they have in place that actually achieve emission reductions. And I think that could have suffered the leverage and reputation that they got from those very important pieces, could have suffered a little bit in Paris if it had gone the other way. I think, what the president said, and I think most people know, Keystone itself was mostly symbolic. It wasn't going to have that much of a greenhouse gas impact. It wasn't going to actually help the economy that much. But it grew into this huge iconic issue. And, a lot of, I was one who said, this is really not where you need to focus. This isn't as important as like getting behind the Clean Power Plan. That's really more important. But, it turned out that it really mobilized a lot of the public and on an issue. And I think it would have been difficult for the president to permit it and continue to have the stance that he's had on climate change and looking at his legacy. That said, we're going to come up with this again and again. So what is a broader, longer-lasting policy then on infrastructure development and on keeping carbon in the ground? That's a lot harder, and I think that's one that there's not a real clear answer how that movement is going to translate into future efforts. I love that it's happening, and I wish that it could be spread to have people on the ground advocating for all the other things that we know will actually really help reduce emissions, like in states that are suing EPA to keep them from implementing the Clean Power Plan. Could we get activists out there in the same way that they were about Keystone in those states, in Texas? That I think that would be really meaningful. But on the whole, I think it's a really interesting case study in how advocacy can help shift the winds. On top of, I would say, most importantly though, the economic reasons for accepting the pipeline application also changed significantly over the course of the 6 years that it was being considered, and the economic case for permitting it just isn't there anymore. So that, I would say, if that hadn't happened, it might not have come out the way that it did.
So a lot of this will have impacts on the workforce in the U.S. and where kind of careers go, which impacts a few people in this room, I think. Does your group look at that at all in terms of what some of these trends are going to be, and how like the coal industry might disappear, but these new industries that are going to explode? I mean, some people obviously saw that solar was going to have its explosive growth over these last few years, but are you seeing other areas that you think might surprise people?
No, not necessarily. I think, there's trends that have been happening for a long time without necessarily the Clean Power Plan affecting coal, reducing demand, lower cost solar and other options, the other pollution, health impacts of coal. I think that in general, there is a real need for a strategy to deal with those communities that are so, that are dependent on that resource and on that type of economic activity. that's going to be really important as we move ahead. And the transition to new sectors it's not going to be easy for a lot of people. And I don't think that where we're going now, which is looking like natural gas as a bridge, natural gas being used to fuel relatively efficient power plants, maybe used in fuel cells to produce hydrogen for vehicles. That's not a sector that's going to go away in the same way that coal has been. And demand for oil will continue to be high in most of the world. I don't see that happening as quickly. I think the economic forces that hit the coal industry were predominant. But that's, and this is a constant issue in the U.S. For a long time, people couldn't, the biggest problem was what to do with all the horse shit from all the horses that we were using. And that was like what policymakers' biggest problem when they projected how much of it would be in the streets. They're like, what are we going to do? They couldn't anticipate another type of economy that ran on other. So this has been happening over and over. We've been transitioning to and from different industries. I think what is interesting, and I'm here in Austin, very important in the Silicon Valley too, is the sort of the connectivity, the Internet of Things, sort of how do we massively expand the efficiency of everything we do, and the connectivity. That's something that I think has the potential to be really important. It could go many ways in terms of jobs, but I think it's everything is changing. Not least of which is probably the climate driver.
Thank you.
Didn't the Rhodium group with CSIS last year release Remaking American Power?
That's right.
Right, and did that not show at a granular level the economic net benefit of the Clean Power Plan? So to his question about the economic stimulus or stimulating effects on the economy of this transition, this decarbonization transition from fossils to renewables, CSIS and Rhodium and many others have looked at this, not just in the U.S., but in sub-Saharan Africa and elsewhere, and almost across the board. I have yet to see an analysis that shows that is not net beneficial to economies. Mm-hmm. Hillary Clinton just came out with, yesterday or today, I didn't read the detail, but talking about the recognition that some people in the coal country and those who are employed in the fossil areas are going to be losing, those jobs are going away. Those jobs in Kentucky and elsewhere in coal country aren't coming back. What do you do with those communities? She's actually, like I said, I didn't read the details, but she's addressed that. But a question, though, in this, from what someone had said earlier, one of the impediments of prior conferences has been the distribution of income or the technological transfer from the developed to the developing. Last month, they pared the final draft down to 20 pages. What is the status? What do you know the status to be of the the Green Climate Fund, and where do the developing countries stand? What are their demands? Because that's typically been a big sticking point in prior negotiations. Where does that stand currently, 3 weeks out or 2 weeks out from Paris?
This is one of those issues, the sort of technology as a component of the agreement, a component of the negotiations, that's been really interesting because it's really at the heart of everything. Transitioning to low emitting economy is all about the technology, but it's really unclear what an international agreement can do beyond. So, in every iteration, Kyoto, Copenhagen, now, every year there's, they develop new institutions and new labs and new centers for development and R&D. It's really hard. There's not like a technology silver bullet, so it ends up being about creating new institutions to help bring people together to do more R&D or to build capacity on technology issues. And then it's about money. So a lot of the conversation is about how much money developed countries should provide for developing countries. And then the final piece of it is IP. So a lot of the real contentious debate has been this assertion that the best way to allow countries, developing countries to adapt clean energy is for us to just give them the IP. Of course, that's a no-go for most other countries because the views of the developed countries or of countries that are innovating is that that's what drives innovation, is the ability for countries to maintain the IP. So I don't know where that stands right now. I would say that in general there will likely be statements about the importance, about highlighting sectors and issues that are important, about the need to ramp up R&D, and about partnering with private sector, and then a call for more money to go into those efforts. But in general, it's like after you've created 5 or 10 iterations of an institution to help with technology, it's not clear what the next thing is beyond helping those move forward and actually do what they were supposed to do. So I'm not sure where that's going to end up. I would say it's not one of the top priority issues, or it's likely to get, because there are so many other things going on, to get lower down in the chain.
We're slightly over time, but we'll take a quick question and perhaps a quick response.
Hi. In this previous legislative session in the Texas legislature, Senate Bill 77 was introduced, which would have required state agencies to include climate change in their policies or their plans. It didn't even make it out of committee, and from what I've been told, anything that mentions climate change does not even make it out of committee in the Texas legislature. Do you think that it's possible for Texas as a state to make adequate progress towards reducing its carbon emissions in a government that's not even willing to acknowledge the science through other drivers like economic, et cetera?
Wow, I get to talk about Texas among Texans, but most of the industry is already saying that they can do it. I would guess that that's a good sign. Most of the electric power utilities are on course or say that they can do it. Wind is going gangbusters. The way that it worked in Congress was we just took climate change out of everything, but it still did the same things. There are ways around it. I think there's an evolving conversation now about what it is that needs to be done. And when you stop talking about climate change and you talk about the nuts and bolts of expanding clean energy, the business case for it is there already, that's what's going to make progress in areas where the political dynamics are too complicated. So I wouldn't be in total despair, though of course that evolves, but get creative about what you call things and try to get the same outcome, and I think that's likely the path for Texas these days.
Thank you so much.
Oh, good.
Presentations around climate change.
Oh, really?
Something really grounded in
Yeah.
why one
Oh, good.